Thank you, everybody, for joining our wonderful panel here. Time for a paradigm shift on Palestine. This is part of a workshop series that was organized by an amazing group of Bernie delegates or progressive delegates from Virginia, who have mobilized and worked so hard and tirelessly for days now and weeks to try to set something up to elevate the progressive voice and to give a platform to those who often don't have a platform to speak up. This is really a pleasure and an honor to have the speakers I do have here, and I'm going to introduce them in a second. But before we get into the thick of things, I would like to tell everybody here that questions will be taken. So as our speakers are giving their speeches, please feel free to write questions in the question and answer section at the bottom, or I think in the chat, and I'll be taking them down, and then we're going to go over them at the end. You can ask as many questions as you like, and I'll try my best to go through them diligently. So my name is Zeina Ashrawi Hutchison. I'm the host of this event, and I am currently a Bernie State and National Delegate from Virginia. I was born in Jerusalem and raised in Ramallah during the first and second intifadas, and I came to the States as a teenager and older, in my late teens. But now, and I've dedicated the rest of, since then, I've essentially finished my college degree and then became a mom, a dedicated mom to my kids most of my adult life, basically. And for those of you who aren't aware, today is the Virginia Democratic State Convention. And even though this is not necessarily part of the DPVA, the Democratic Party of Virginia, our delegates are today voting on a really amazing package of resolutions that contains amazing progressive resolutions on the Green New Deal, Medicare for all. But for me in particular, there's a very, very special resolution in there that I worked on. It's my first resolution to ever write, and it was about Palestine. It has passed in Congressional District 10 and in Congressional District 8. And if it passes at state level, it could be, history in the making. It is truly, it's an honor to be a part of history, because not very often Palestinians get a voice to speak up and a platform to speak up. And a huge part of that is due to the fact that somebody like Bernie Sanders gave a platform and elevated the voice of those of us who typically go unnoticed unless we make a lot of noise. So I'm really excited to see the resolution package pass, and I'm elated to have my Palestinian resolution in there. And for those of you who don't know, even though there was a discrepancy towards the end and they changed the resolution package, I don't know if it was meant to be, but the resolution was on page 67, which is pretty, for those of you who know Palestinian history, 1967 was when West Bank and Gaza were essentially occupied. So it was pretty fascinating to see. I took a picture of it and I'll post it later in the chat. That said, it's on this day, it's a really special day, and I'm honored that everybody's joining us, and Huwaida and Nour are here too. A brief background. So when Bernie Sanders ran for the presidency, I felt compelled to do something, to join and help out. It wasn't enough to just sit around and just wait for something to change. Initially, I wasn't doing anything necessarily on Palestine in particular. I wanted to learn the process, and I encourage anybody who's watching, particularly younger ones, Palestinians in particular, but anybody, younger youth, to become part of this movement. It's not hard. You just have to ask questions and get involved, which is what I did. I might not be as young as I hope we can bring people in, but I went in full force. I did basically everything that everybody else was doing. I was knocking on doors and making phone calls and not knowing what I was doing. I was just, following the movement with a passion, because it was, participating in the progressive movement is very important to me. It's not just something on paper. It's substantial, it's substantive. But then when Bernie Sanders suspended his campaign after the Tuesday, after Super Tuesday, there was a kind of a lull, and we, for a second there, were all kind of stunned and confused. But what motivated me was how the delegates mobilized immediately. Everybody mobilized, and we started learning about the process of writing resolutions. Most of us had never written resolutions, but we went to work. And we, right now, like I was saying in the state convention, we have over 100 resolutions that we submitted. And this is a teamwork effort. I'm so proud to be a part of this incredible team. I mean, humbled, truly. A little while ago, there was a multiple different workshops on resolutions. There's a resolutions workshop happening now by my friend, hosted by my friend Salma Makar and others. But it's truly humbling. So once we started writing resolutions, we kind of started learning policy, and not just for me, not just about Palestine. There are things that I never really delved into before, and it was so eye-opening and so amazing to be a part of it. So after we worked so hard on the resolutions and submitted them, we learned about the process. And for many people, it's so obscure and so out of reach that you don't realize the effect and the amount of influence people could have on their own political situation in their own, especially in America, especially in our system here. There is an opportunity, and I encourage every single one of you guys to try to reach out, to ask questions, to be involved. It's not hard, and we're here to help. Most of the delegates didn't know what it's like to write resolutions, but we did, and we submitted, and now we're voting on them, and this is a huge success. Like I said, Senator Bernie Sanders gave us a platform and heard our message loudly, I think. And I hope to continue using that platform to elevate many different voices, not just the Palestinian voice, but many different voices, and bring them in. I am also touched by the support I've gotten on Palestine in particular from my fellow delegates and other progressive volunteers. I could not have expected the level of support and encouragement and solidarity on every level, whether it's with my fits when I was so angry about political situations that I hear about on the news, or whether it's the elation of my resolutions passing, or a resolution passing, not just mine. It's incredible. And I'm grateful to every single one of you that's watching for your support, for your encouragement, and for believing that we could do this together. And particularly on Palestine, it's not easy to fight for your voice to be heard. And you guys heard my voice and you supported me, and I'm grateful for that. And my involvement, as I know most people's involvement in the grassroots movement, is not just an image. We don't just do this because we want recognition or because it's easy. We do this because we heard the call for action, and there is a need for work to be done. It's not enough to sit on the sidelines. Like I always say, we have to take charge. So we genuinely believe in the call for justice and the call for equality, and to put an end to a system of racism. So before we begin, I want to say that I stand in full solidarity with my Black brothers and sisters here in America, and I will fight by your side the whole way. I will continue to demonstrate, go to protests, I will continue to speak up, and I will continue to elevate your voice, because I also do know what it's like I do know racism. And I support you, and I love you, and I'm here for you always, and I'm an ally, and I'm always here. If you ever need anything, let me know how I can be the best ally I can be. As Palestinians, we know the positivity and the power in allies. Now to our panelists who are here with us today, it's more than an honor to introduce these two people, not just because they're Palestinian. I mean, that just goes without saying. I'm proud of that. But because these are two incredibly strong, powerful voices for Palestine, who have been working tirelessly for the Palestinian cause for many years. With Huwaida and with Nour, when I was younger, I would look up, and I still do, I look up to both of them. I learn from them. They inspire me constantly. They give me hope constantly. And those definitely go without saying. But for me also, something that's really empowering is the fact that we are all mothers of children. And it's not easy to do what we do, to constantly be in the thick of things, and to constantly have to balance politics and family, but also the emotions that go with both. So I'm honored and I'm proud to be a mother with two amazing Palestinian mothers who are joining me, powerful voices. So now, another quick thing to say, actually, before I move on, I want to thank Amer Zahr, who has also stood by me and helped me continuously, who is also helping now with the back tech thing that's going on here. So I'm grateful to you, Amer. I'm also grateful to Hanna Hanania and many of the people in his group of friends who have not given up on me, who have empowered me continuously without asking anything. As soon as I say I needed help with something, immediately they, including Amer, including, you know, the delegates, everybody jumped in. And I'm truly grateful. And I'm grateful for my husband and my kids who have also helped me tremendously. Like now they're locked in the basement and playing video games, so they're not interrupting this conversation, but that goes with being a mother and an activist. This is, you know, we make do. Now to politics. While Israel carries on with its July 1st threat to escalate and expedite the annexation of parts of the West Bank, and as the US government is set to vote on a bipartisan bill to continue sending a minimum of $3.8 billion in our taxes to Israel annually and unconditionally, the Palestinian people continue to call on the world to demand an end to Israeli apartheid. It is incumbent upon every one of us to stand up to the injustice, hold Israel accountable, and to listen to Palestinian voices. Two of these Palestinian voices are here with us, like I mentioned earlier, Nour Odeh and Huwaida Arraf. We're going to start with Nour Odeh. Nour Odeh is a progressive political analyst, an award-winning journalist, and a writer, a member of the Palestinian Task Force on the US, and a public diplomacy consultant. Thank you so much, Nour, for being here. For those of you who don't know, Nour is actually in Palestine right now. It is 2:30 in the morning. She was, you know, she's up. She wasn't feeling well, and she still managed to be here with us. So, Nour, thank you so much for being here, and I give you the floor.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for having me in this panel. And to all those who are joining the conversation now and in the moments to come, I'm here to tell you why somebody like me who lives thousands of miles away, who doesn't vote in your elections, is affected by how you vote and the decisions you make about the representatives you choose, not just at the federal level, but at every level of government. And I'll get into that and I'll explain it. The issue of Palestine and Israel comes up a lot in American political narrative, but the way it comes up is part of the problem. So you hear a lot about security, about common values, about how complicated things are, and so we don't really need to get into it, but rather let's just focus on the main things. And these are all tactics that I think if we deconstruct them, we'll realize that they're diversionary tactics. They're meant to steer you away from what the issues are and what the reality is and why it should matter to you. So let me just explain very briefly why I'm here and what my life is like under occupation, what it means to be under occupation. Israeli occupation. Living under occupation means that you are deprived of agency, not necessarily your personal agency, but definitely the choices that are imposed on you affect every aspect of your life. Let me give you a very simple example. Moving from one city to another in the occupied West Bank is controlled by the Israeli army, a foreign army that dominates the lives of an entire nation, my nation, the Palestinian nation. So if I need to plan a trip from, say, Ramallah to Bethlehem, I need to know that the checkpoints on the way are open, that I will be allowed through, and that the level of risk that I will be taking is within acceptable limits. So I might get shot, but I need to know the likelihood. Is it really high or low? And then make decisions accordingly. But it doesn't stop there. It's not just about the soldier at the checkpoint. It's also about what I can buy at the grocery store, because the entry of goods into our cities is also controlled by the Israeli army. The entry of all sorts of things, construction material, infrastructure material, is also up to the decision of the Israeli occupation authorities. So if they decide that we don't need pipes of a certain size because they deem that these are not necessary for Palestinians, then we simply don't have them, and we need to readjust our plans. If they decide that coriander is too much of a luxury product for Palestinians, then we won't have them in the supermarket. And I don't mean to make occupation sound trivial, but I'm just trying to give you an idea of just how prevalent being an occupying power is, just how imposing it is to be an occupying power. You literally have control, not just over who lives or dies, but over how the population you live under lives. And that reality that is unacceptable anywhere else, that does not adhere to any of the values of freedom, of equality, of social justice, of human dignity, that reality is entrenched and empowered and perpetuated because of the 3.8 billion US dollars of your money that go to Israel every year, because of successive American administrations that have made sure that Israel is always held above the law, that it's not held accountable for any violations of international law or of Palestinian rights, and because somehow in the American conversation, talking about Palestinians has been made to feel as if you are being either anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, which I think to a lot of the Israeli advocates for human rights and the anti-occupation advocates, I think it drives them crazy more than it drives us, because even their voices are being muted. So, and that is why what you do will affect our lives, and that is why we follow what you do very closely. We follow the debates in the Democratic Party. We follow the debate between the establishment in the party and the progressives in the party, and we maintain hope that the consistency that is required for having the moral authority to talk about issues of social justice and of fighting racism and fighting all forms of structural violence, these issues will not exclude Palestine any longer. I think it's about time that that conversation is had. Right now, there's a lot of talk about annexation. I know there are a lot of letters that are being circulated around. There are 158, I think now, Democratic members of the House who are writing to oppose Israel's annexation plans. What does it mean for Israel to plan on annexing land it already occupies and controls? It means that it will be legislating the theft of this land. It will be making it part of the territory of the state of Israel, and it will be altering, at least it wants to, the status of this land to become Israeli, in effect denying its relevance or its ownership by the Palestinian people. Now, right now, the only countries that don't recognize the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, to be occupied Palestinian territory are regrettably the United States, Micronesia, and a few other satellite countries that have no say in their foreign policy because they follow the US administration. Everybody else in the world recognizes the legal fact that these are territories occupied by the Israeli army by force in 1967, and that the two-state formula that everybody seems to be enchanted with means that Israel has to withdraw from that territory, that it has to leave that territory in order for Palestinians to establish their own state on it, or to realize their sovereignty over it, rather. So annexation is looming. The US administration is literally mediating between the different Israeli parties on how best to carry out annexation. So the US administration right now is a partner in this endeavor, a partner in making sure that Palestinians are never able to realize their rights as sovereigns in their own land. Now, why does that matter? Why should it matter to you? Well, it matters, I think, because first of all, it establishes a precedent in international diplomacy that legitimizes land grab and land theft, and that will have wide ranging repercussions, not just in Palestine, but it will affect how world diplomacy is conducted. And if Israel is allowed to steal and grab land at will because it has the military power and the backing of Donald Trump and company, then other countries that believe they have the military power and have extraterritorial aspirations will be able to do the same. And it will be very difficult to convince them that Israel is the only exception here. But I think what's most interesting and what should concern people more about the conversation that's being had about annexation in the United States is the fact that it's happening in complete absence of any mention of Palestinians. So we talk about Israeli settlements, which are a violation of international law. They're a war crime. And Israel is told, well, please don't do it because it makes you look bad. It's not good for you. It doesn't serve your interest. And now, when we're talking about annexation, Democratic leaders and I don't know if we've heard from any Republicans, but a lot of political leaders are telling Israel, you know what, we have these traditional, very strong, ironclad support for Israel, as you know, but we don't want you to go through with the annexation because it's bad for Israel. Palestinians, the Palestinian people, human rights, international law, none of that is part of the conversation. And I think if we're going to be honest about what is wrong with that picture, we need to talk about the structural racism, the systematic racism with which Palestinians have been treated. We've been done away with by way of erasure. So we don't exist in the conversation. We don't exist in the panels on TV. We're not talked about in terms of policy. Our rights are not addressed. Our humanity is not recognized. And all policy discussions that happen in the context of discussing what is best for Israel. And nobody's asking the American public or the American lawmakers to suddenly wake up and become anti-Israeli. But I think what's very important for progressives and for Democrats, if they want to set themselves apart from what we now see in the United States, thanks to Donald Trump, is consistency. You cannot be pro-human rights for some and not others. You cannot be pro-rule of law for some and not others. You cannot exclude groups from that universality because of their race, because of their origin, because of their nationality. Palestinians cannot remain the exception to all those values that are talked about as the foundation of American policy, or so we hope them to be. And I think maybe a lot of hope is in the grassroots movement, is what we see on the streets from Palestine. And we really, really do follow all of that very closely. We see that our struggle intersects with the struggles in the United States. Our humanity cannot be diluted and it cannot be compartmentalized to only be relevant when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so we stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the Black communities across the United States who are finally rising up and talking about the structural violence and racism that they face and the need for real change, not cosmetic change. But I think in order to be consistent as a party, you guys, you who vote, need to make sure that your leaders are also consistent, that they vote in a manner consistent with what you're demanding, that when you talk about any issue, Palestine or Yemen or Tibet or any other issue, that the standard applied is always the same. So it cannot be that we are for democracy and human rights, but in Palestine, it's very complicated and we can't really get into it. And it's not really about that, and it's not really about human rights and self-determination. It's about Israeli security. No, you can't do that. You can't do that if you want to be consistent. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. I have to give it to Donald Trump, and I think you know more than anybody else. His administration has been able to create a parallel reality for everything. So there are alternative facts for everything when it comes to Donald Trump. But particularly when it comes to Palestine, Donald Trump has been able to disrupt the foundations of the conversation. So we're no longer considered under occupation. Jerusalem is no longer considered occupied. Settlements are no longer considered illegal. All the rules that apply, that the whole world accepts, are no longer applicable. And what Donald Trump wants to do, and is mediating between Israelis to do, is to have us acquiesce to the annexation of our land, to our permanent subjugation, to our permanent oppression, our permanent denial of self-determination. And we, in the meantime, are required to prove worthy of these gifts from the Trump administration and from the Israeli right wing, and to prove that we deserve to be talked to and to have a conversation with, and to maybe possibly discuss some measures of self-governance. That's not what we're asking for, and that's not what we're entitled to. And to suggest anything else is not just in line with this alternative ideology, but I think it's indicative of the racism with which Palestinians are viewed, and that needs to change. But again, it's not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump didn't create a coup d'etat in American policy towards Palestinians. Donald Trump took it to a whole new level, just like he took everything else to a whole new, very bad level in US domestic policies. But when it comes to Palestine, he has really done strategic harm because he's empowered the worst elements that could possibly be empowered in this conflict. And he's made the worst allies that he could possibly have in the region as well. But birds of feather flock together, so that's no surprise. But successive American administrations have made it a policy to ignore us, to talk about the future and peace as it relates to Israeli interests. And Joe Biden, by the way, is no stranger to that. I don't know if many of you have read, but there's an article that talked about his role in toning down Barack Obama and his agenda for the Middle East. Not that he was about to create a revolution, but he always told Obama not to sacrifice a lot of political capital for small fish, the small fish being us, the Palestinians, our right to self-determination, to freedom, to a life of dignity. So to be honest with you, it's a bit concerning to see that rather than having the competition right now, leading up to November, be between Donald Trump, and we know who he is and what he stands for, and a progressive, consistent force, regardless of who the person is, on the other side. Right now, we have Donald Trump versus the traditional establishment in the Democratic Party that doesn't want to shake the boat, that doesn't want to change the rules, doesn't want to change the conversation. And at this point, I think what needs to be very clear is that for the Palestinian people, this is a matter of life and death. We can't afford to not have the conversation shifted anymore. And I know that a lot of my colleagues and countrymen and few women have played the game of groveling and trying to prove that, we have been made docile enough, that we're peaceful enough, that we're friendly enough, that we don't bite. But I don't think that's the point. I think if we're going to have a conversation between equals, and that's what we are, between allies, and that's what we should be, then it has to be about our common values, not the cliches, but the real values, where we see each other as equals of equal worth, entitled to the same rights, and marching in the same struggle for social justice, for human rights, for respect and dignity. We cannot possibly have that if we are literally under the knee of an Israeli soldier and being asked to prove that we won't hurt that soldier who is oppressing and occupying us. The continuation of the Israeli occupation, regardless of how the annexation is announced and how it moves forward, is an indignity. It's not just a crime under international law. It is something that is done in spite of the humanity of an entire nation. And it's time to change that. So what we're asking, I think, is for that conversation to shift, because once it does, then decisions change. Once you're able to see the other, then you can engage the other, and you can interact with the other, and have considerations that are completely different from the normal talking points. I don't want to take too much time, and I want to give enough time for Huwaida and also for questions, but I want to conclude with a short story, just to show you how engaged we are and how much we follow international affairs, because again, it really does affect us. In 2012, I met the Australian ambassador to the United Nations. He was on a visit to Palestine, and he visited a very remote community in the southern West Bank that is facing eviction and expulsion to make way for settlement roads and Israeli only infrastructure in the occupied West Bank. Shortly before his arrival, there was a very important resolution that was voted on at the United Nations to elevate Palestine's status to an observer state. Australia did not vote in favor of that resolution. And the ambassador was completely shocked that this Bedouin community in the southern hills of the occupied West Bank knew very well where his country stood. And they asked him about it. And they asked him to justify why he didn't think that we deserved a seat among other states. And to explain how that bodes with the fact that he was telling them about Australia's position in defense of human rights and international law and so on and so forth. The man, I think this changed his perspective quite profoundly. But this is just to tell you how much we do follow these things. Yes, we are curious people, we are well educated, but it's not just that. It's really literally because what you do in your state, in your city, affects what happens in mine. And with that, I think the last connection I think I'll make before I hand over, Zeina, is that another way that you can make a difference and you can stay consistent with your values is to make sure that the space given to Palestinian voices, to Palestinian, American, Israeli, international, non-government organizations, NGOs, does not keep shrinking. Another dimension that is being used to combat Palestinian narrative, to combat Palestinian rights, is to demonize and criminalize Palestinian advocacy. And that's extremely, extremely dangerous. Fighting, having a political fight is one thing. Criminalizing civil society is a completely different thing. They are being starved of their resources. They are being criminalized. They're being victimized by legal action against them that basically aims to bankrupt them into non-existence. And that's because any talk about Palestinian rights is now being considered or being advocated as incitement and hate speech. And I think this is extremely dangerous, and it deserves a lot of attention because it's not just at the federal level in the US, it's at the local level and at the state level. The resolutions that your elected officials do adopt quietly and without much fanfare affects all of us, affects you as well, and your ability to practice your freedom of expression and to express where you stand on many issues. You must be able to have the right to speak up about what you believe in when it comes to Palestine and other issues. And if that space is banned, then a lot is lost. And I think if we go back in history, a lot of peoples wouldn't be free now, including those in South Africa, had civil society not been able to be active, to be vocal, and to be heard. They're the ones who moved governments forward. It wasn't the other way around. They were far ahead of governments that didn't want to move forward, that didn't want to fight apartheid, that didn't want to fight the injustice in South Africa. And right now, I think the same can be said. Actually, I'm sure, I'm not just thinking, I know that civil society around the world is far ahead of governments, has far more courage and far more principled than governments worldwide. Even those who profess to support international law but still refuse to hold Israel accountable, they are way behind civil society around the world, scholars and writers and legal experts who've written hundreds of letters and articles in the past few weeks and months and years about Israeli occupation, about the upcoming or the looming annexation, and about why this whole regime should end, and not just when we talk about annexation, it's one act, it's the final act. But really, it's the regime of control, of land grab, of colonialism and dehumanization, because it wouldn't be able to persist without the dehumanizing of Palestinians. So keep an eye for that and please hold your elected officials accountable to that so you can save your rights and mine. Thank you.
No, that was amazing. I'm so grateful for your voice. Always grateful for your voice. You are an amazing representative of the Palestinian people, and I'm grateful for your presentation. Our next speaker, a dear friend, an incredible activist, is Huwaida Arraf. She is a human rights and civil rights and international law attorney and a consultant, a longtime activist, and a co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement. And I cannot describe her in my own words, but once you start hearing her speak, you'll understand why she's here. Over to you, Huwaida.
Thank you, Zeina, and thank you, Nour. That was amazing and didn't leave very much for me to cover, which is great. You made it easier on me. Let me start by thanking everyone for being here, and to also echo Zeina and Nour in expressing my profound love and solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters. We are right there with you. In fact, I was just thinking, since the killing of George Floyd, which honestly, I could not even watch the whole video, but I went and on our cars put all kinds of messages about Black Lives Matter and the name of George Floyd, and as others were being killed, their names on my car. And I'm keeping it there, and I'm driving around, especially because I live in a largely Republican county and neighborhood. And the other day, as I was going out to my car, this Black man who worked at the store that I was shopping at, he said, I was just waiting to see who was driving that car. And he thanked me, and I just was stunned. And I'm like, no, thank you. Thank you for your power and grace, and the grace with which for hundreds of years you have fought, and for what you're teaching us, and for the power and strength that you're giving to the new generation, and for the fact that you're only demanding equality and not really revenge for all that has been done. And I'm there with you. And I think that that's how I would like to think that I'm not only speaking for myself, but a large number of the majority of the Palestinian people as we look to the Black struggle. And as Zeina and Nour said, we understand and we are with you and we are learning from you, and hope to do as much as we can for your liberation, for our liberation. So from there, a lot of things of what Nour said has got me thinking, and one of the things she talked about was how we have to really talk about our common values. And Nour was talking about common values of human rights, of respect, of equality for people. And I was just thinking of how the United States and Israel have abused that for decades, because Israel always says, the United States always says how Israel is our greatest ally in the Middle East and we share common values with Israel. But what are those common values? I mean, that's true, but when the United States says it or when Israel says it, they try to put it off as if it's common values of democracy and common values of human rights, when it's just the opposite. And I wouldn't even put it in my words, but the words of one of my heroes, Angela Davis, who when she talked about what Palestine has meant to her, she explained that in her own political history, Palestine has always occupied a pivotal place precisely because of the similarities between Israel and the United States. Their foundation in settler colonialism, their ethnic cleansing processes with respect to indigenous people, their systems of segregation, and their use of legal systems to enact systems of oppression, and so on and so forth. And so those are the common values that the states, that the United States and Israel are really building off and developing their policies around. And I say that what Nour was also saying, in that we reach beyond that, the people, in joining and asserting the common values that we want to see, which are not of settler colonialism and militarism and militarized policing and the things that keep people down, not of white supremacy, but we are raising our voices for the future that we want to see. So when we talk about common values, or when the states talk about common values, let's keep that in mind. It's common values that for too long has elevated a whiteness and colonialism, and that is what we're fighting against. So we unite our common values, which are grounded in human rights, to push for an end to US militarism, US exporting its militarism, occupying and supporting Israel's occupation now, and not just occupation. And Nour put it very eloquently about what it means to be occupied. But when we talk about occupation, we tend to refer to the West Bank and Gaza, which Israel militarily occupied in 1967. But before that, in 1948, Israel also illegally it acquired territory by force. It acquired 78% of our historic homeland. It made 750,000 Palestinians refugees. Now we are the largest refugee population in the world. And those refugees are not allowed to come home, despite UN resolutions. They're not allowed to come home because they're not Jewish. And so we have this ethno-religious superiority also going on, along with this white superiority that is guiding Israel's policies, and that the US is enabling. So Israel occupied 78% of our homeland, and now the world recognizes it as being the state of Israel. And so when we're talking about a Palestinian state, or when we're talking about the lands that are now legally occupied, we're talking about the West Bank and Gaza, which is only 22% of our homeland. But Israel really never recognized, as Nour said, that it's an occupying force. And I would say it's an occupation, but occupation is only a tactic, let me say, of what has been Israel's larger plan, which is to colonize the land. It has always been the plan to get as much of the land as possible with as little of the people on it as possible. And so Israel keeps expanding its tentacles, building more settlements or exclusive Jewish communities on land that is occupied, moving more people in there and pushing more Palestinians out, demolishing Palestinians' homes, exiling Palestinians, locking Palestinians in certain enclaves like Gaza, which I will touch on in a minute. And it's really not a secret. Of course, this is not what it's projected to the world, but no colonized country has ever talked about, what their plans really are. They always put it in the context of, they're fighting savages, or they're fighting terrorists, or they are bringing civilization to somewhere that is not civilized. And Israel has followed a lot of the same rhetoric, included in that, that they are this small democratic state in a sea of violent, undemocratic Arab peoples. And that's what a lot of people have bought. But in reality, we have our Palestinian people, we have been living on this land for centuries. Settlers came in, kicked us out. Now we're just asking for the ability to have self-determination, to live in freedom on a small portion of our historic homeland. And for the number of people that are Palestinian citizens of Israel, which Israel tries to say, we have Palestinian citizens and we treat them wonderful. We're a democratic country, they can vote. Yes, they can vote, but there are also 50 laws on the books and more being legislated every day that legally, according to Israel's law, discriminates against their non-Jewish citizens, including what they passed a couple years ago, which is they call it the nation state law, which basically says that the right to nationhood is exclusive to the Jewish people. Therefore, the Palestinian citizens do not have a right to this nationhood. There are tons of other ones. If we have time, I'll get into it. But so the Palestinian citizens, so they're Israeli citizens, they're supposed to be equal, but they are legally not equal because they are not Jewish. And then we have the Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank in Gaza. Now, Gaza, which is a small territory of land, we're talking 140 square miles, which, to put it in perspective, I think Virginia, I looked this up earlier, is 42,774 square miles, 42,700 square miles. Gaza is 140 square miles. 2 million Palestinians are trapped in Gaza. Israel controls all the land borders, controls the sea, controls the airwaves. Palestinians can't fly over, they can't sail boats out of there, they can't leave by land, they can't get things in or out without Israel's permission. So 2 million Palestinians are trapped in here. If they need medical attention, not available in Gaza. If they need to travel for school, for anything, they need Israel's permission, and frequently it's denied. Israel in 2005 said it ended its occupation of Gaza because it pulled out, it had settlements in Gaza, it pulled those out, they were illegal in the first place, but it said we pulled out, now we ended our occupation. But they did not. What they did was just pull out to the outskirts, put their military there, fences, walls, and trap the people inside. And with that, they still launch military attacks on the people of Gaza. We had a horrendous one just in 2014, in 2012, in 2008, killing thousands of children, of women, demolishing thousands of homes, places of worship, businesses. Today, 45% of the population of Gaza is unemployed, and it's higher when you talk about the younger population. It gets up to 60% when you talk about the youth. At least 70 to 80% of the population is food aid dependent. Because Israel does not allow into Gaza certain necessities to fix the infrastructure, Gaza has a very serious sewage problem, so that over 100 million liters of untreated sewage is dumped into the Mediterranean Sea every single day. Not only is this an environmental disaster, but because Palestinians are not able to import and export freely, and their businesses have been destroyed, and they can't produce and work, their economy has been decimated. A lot of Palestinians turn to their land farming, fishing. So you have fishermen, fishers trying to fish in heavily polluted water because they're not allowed to go out into the Mediterranean. Technically, you're supposed to be able to go out 20 miles to fish any kind of territory. Generally, you have 12 miles of that territory that belongs to the land, the state, and then beyond that also is a kind of an open zone where Palestinians should be allowed to fish. Israel restricts them to 3 miles, sometimes a little bit more. They're more generous, 3 or 4 or 5 miles. If they go beyond that, the fishers get shot at or arrested by the Israeli Navy. And so you have this situation where people are desperate to live. What people eat on any particular day is determined by what Israel has let in to the occupied Gaza Strip. A few years ago, it's been 10 years now, fellow activists and I tried to really draw the world attention to how grave the situation is in Gaza. And that situation, like malnutrition and stunted growth, is rising. And not because Gaza is a poor territory, it's actually very rich in resources. But because this is part of a deliberate policy to bring people to their knees, it is illegal. And the international community is doing nothing about it. So we organized boats to try to go to Gaza and break the naval blockade, to just not even ask Israel's permission and just sail. And that if Israel stops us, we hope to show to the world that Israel's policy is not about security, it's about collective punishment. We hope to stir the world into action. In 2010, we launched a flotilla of boats to Gaza. We had 700 people from dozens of countries, 7 ships carrying 10,000 tons of rebuilding supplies, of wheelchairs, of batteries, of school supplies, all of these things that Israel wouldn't let into Gaza. And Israel launched a lethal attack on our ships. We lost 10 colleagues. One of them was a 19-year-old Turkish American. He was an American citizen named Furkan Dugan. And this was the summer right before he planned to go to med school. A UN Human Rights Committee investigation found that at least 5, if not 6 of the activists on board that were killed by Israeli soldiers were executed. It included Furkan, who had 5 bullets to his body, all of them that entered in his back, 1 to his face at close range. So they probably put the last bullet in his face while he was down. And on the Human Rights Council, when they voted to adopt this report, the United States was the only country to vote against. It had one of its own citizens killed, and it voted against the adoption of this report. And of course, no action was taken against Israel. And it's not the first time that the US acts against the interests of its people, because another one of our volunteers, an American citizen, was killed deliberately by Israeli soldiers in 2003 in Gaza, a 23-year-old college student, Rachel Corey, who was run over by a Caterpillar bulldozer because she tried to stop the demolition of a home of a family that she was staying with while she was living in Gaza. And, at the time, Rachel Corey's parents were asking the United States for an independent investigation, which the Bush administration promised the Corey family, and it never happened. It never happened, and the Corey family still has not gotten any justice. And I say that because it took you back, because it's obviously still going on today. Just last month, we have a situation here in the United States where millions are unemployed. Obviously, a large number of people are dying. We are in crisis here. A lot of people need help, businesses, average Americans, and we know the Black and brown and disadvantaged members of the communities here, they are being the hardest hit. And on May 21st, the US Senate had a business meeting to pass certain resolutions, and an important one on their work list was a Senate bill to ensure that Israel will continue to get the $3.8 billion a year in money. And not only that, so not only figuring out that, we're going to ensure that despite the economic crisis being suffered by Americans here, we're going to send $3.8 billion to Israel, but the memorandum of understanding that had solidified that, talked about $3.8 billion. The Senate resolution, they passed an amendment in that work meeting saying at least, this much. It's not a ceiling, basically. And they passed other amendments to make it much more friendly to Israel. So I can leave time for questions. Where we are today is we have, at best, people talk about a peace process and two states. But not only has Israel made two states, we're Palestinians, again, we're only asking for a state in 22% of our homeland. That is really no longer feasible, with Israel talking about annexation. And it's not the first time they've annexed. They've already annexed Jerusalem in 1980. They annexed Jerusalem, and the world said it was illegal, unlawful, called on Israel to pull out, but Israel did not pull out, did not reverse its annexation. And they learned something. Despite the UN Security Council resolution and this condemnation, nobody did anything. Israel faced no repercussions whatsoever. And so they can do it again. Some people might be critical. They might face a little bit of they might get a little slap on the hand here and there. Some states coming out to criticize Israel, but nothing concrete will be done. And the United States has played a big role in that. Because since 1972, the United States has consistently been vetoing UN Security Council resolutions intended to hold Israel accountable. There has only been a handful that have not been vetoed by the United States. So not only is this country providing military support and economic support, but diplomatic support and flexing its muscles in the United Nations and other places to ensure that Israel will not be held accountable, and so it can continue doing what it's doing. So when we talk about today, especially in this moment where in the United States, the movement here, your voices being led by our Black brothers and sisters in the street, demanding accountability, and this country is being forced to reckon with its settler, colonial, and very violent history and racist history. I think that also in the same vein in Palestine, we stopped talking about a two-state. Israel never wanted that. What Palestinians want, demand, deserve is equality and freedom, liberation, retribution. Israel is a settler colonial state, and despite that, Palestinians still say, we don't want to kick you out, we just want to talk about how we can be free too. So what we need to talk about is not, let's say, two-state solution and a peace process. It's not working. Israeli settler colonialism is entrenched, and unless they are forced to dismantle it, to decolonize, there can be no peace. And as Nour said, American citizens, voters, have a big role in that, because as long as we're not looking, we're not connecting our struggles with struggles of people around the world that are fighting militarism, white supremacy, colonialism, then we're kind of standing alone and allowing the effects of some of this stuff to negatively impact and oppress other peoples. But when we recognize what's going on and that our futures are tied together, and that the same forces that are oppressing us are oppressing you, and vice versa, and band together, then we can start to force this decolonization, anti-racism work, moving towards a future that we need to build together. And so votes are important. I'm honestly worried about a Biden presidency because of what Nour talked about and what Biden has already said. You know, in the United States, activists have been calling for boycott. As long as Israel keeps doing this and the international community is not taking steps to hold Israel accountable, we have a tool of boycotting. We're going to boycott Israel. We're going to demand our institutions divest from Israel. And now states and the US Congress is looking to sanction these actions. We have 26 US states that have laws on the books that are intended to penalize people that work for, campaign for, or adopt a position that is supportive of boycotting Israel. And they create this Israel exception. You can boycott a US company, you can boycott a US state, but if you boycott Israel, you are going to pay for it. That's what our politicians are saying when we are not paying attention. And I know you're paying attention, and I thank you for that. And I hope with the work that you're doing, that we're doing in the courtrooms, at the ballot box, and in the streets, we are building a better future for all peoples here. Let me end there. Thank you again for being here. And thank you, Zeina, again for organizing this.
Huwaida, thank you so much. What an incredible speech. Informative and touching and so true. And you know, I'm so thankful that you're on our side and doing the work that needs to be done and speaking up when all the time, not just now. I'm grateful to just be a tiny part of this. Just a couple of things I just want to mention briefly. The bill that Huwaida mentioned is Bill 3176, and it passed the Committee on Foreign Affairs. It was snuck, basically, like Huwaida said. It still did not pass the Senate, and so we need to keep the renewal, not last year's, because this is renewed. So we, some of you know, I've been very vocal about this. We still, no matter what, always, we need to reach out to our senators and our congresspeople and continuously push for them to say no, to stop, to condition the aid. It's extremely important. I mean, some asked what they can do. This is one simple action. Another thing I wanted to quickly add is Huwaida and Nour both touched on, which is the connection with the Black Lives Matter and the way, particularly George Floyd was essentially murdered. Is a tactic that Israel uses on the Palestinian people regularly. And I know some of you have seen that before, but American police force are trained, some of them are trained in Israel or by Israeli police forces. So there's a lot of similarities with the outreach that we saw here as a Palestinian. It really, I mean, other than the fact that it's unconscionable wherever it is, but to see it happening here in America, where I'm raising my children and Huwaida is raising her children, we're all raising our children, where I thought they would be, you know, wouldn't be exposed to this horrific oppression, and we see it, and it's you know, it's unconscionable. So that's another thing that needs to be exposed, and we need to ask that it stops. That said, you guys, we have a couple of questions, and this goes for either one of you, but we can start with the first one. Is I answered a little bit of it, but what can the average American do to help? Maybe Huwaida, you want to start with that one?
Sure. So some of you have raised, I've seen some comments in the question and answer or comment section, and I do believe that contacting your member of Congress is important, because if they're constantly hearing by just the, you know, Israel has a very powerful lobby here, and it funds a lot of campaigns. It is constantly at Congress members' doors. But I firmly believe that if more Americans show that they are concerned, are calling their members of Congress, then we can, in a sense, outpower the power of the pro-Israel lobby. So calls and letters to members of Congress are really important. We also have, I don't know if Zeina is going to drop a link to, we have an organization, and we have a lot of wonderful, actually, grassroots organizations, but one of them called the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and it has a resource on boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It is part of a call that was put out by Palestinians in 2004, 2005 for the global community to engage in these kind of grassroots actions to hold Israel accountable, to boycott. And we modeled this call on really South African anti-apartheid movement and the way that they used divestment. And the call came just a couple of years after Palestinian delegation was in South Africa and discussing with South African colleagues about what could be done. So there is a global call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and it can be done on all kinds of levels. There have been, student councils in schools passing divestment resolutions. There are boycotts of certain products and so they've been done very creatively and on different levels, at your work, in your union, your institutions, personally, certain products that you buy. So they have good resources on that website, the US campaign. And there's also another great resource there. I think it's called Together We Rise, and it talks about a Palestinian vision for freedom and liberation that is also tied to other liberation movements. And there's a curriculum in there that is for use, and I think it's great. So if we drop that link, that could be a good resource.
Thank you, Huwaida. I just did for you guys. It's in the chat. USCPR.org. We have thank you, Huwaida. The next question is, and it's going to Nour. What is your message to Justin Trudeau now that Canada has lost her Security Council bid? So let's stop with that one because it's a longer. And let me just preface this by saying that we really do have to end at 9. So and I want to answer. There's a couple more questions. So please let's.
Well, I mean, just briefly, I don't think he deserves more than 30 or 40 seconds. I think Justin Trudeau should have learned a very good lesson by now. When you oppose Palestinian rights at the United Nations, when you fight the very foundations of international law at the United Nations because you are a hypocrite and you stand against Palestinian rights, there are consequences. And that's exactly what that miserable failure was at the UN. So hats off to the activists who raised their voice and made sure that people knew that Canadians don't think that this Canada under Trudeau deserves a seat at the UN Security Council, but also this was, countries telling Canada where its place is, and I think it was very well deserved.
Yep. So the next question is in the chat. It's quite long. It's in the Q&A. How do you respond to those that argue that Trump actually benefits the Palestinian movement as his actions help drive Americans away from blind support to Israel and encourages them to look at US-Israel relations critically? And let's start with Nour and then we'll go to Huwaida.
I think this is a very, very good question. And maybe, yes, in retrospect, we will, God forbid, thank Trump for something. I hope not. But I think, yes, I mean, when things get really bad, when you see such a terrible example of everything you don't stand for, then you want to run in the opposite direction. And that's what's happening on issues like Palestine and like race relations and so many other things. I think the danger, though, is that in conjunction with all of that, what we were talking about is happening, criminalizing activism for Palestine, demonizing activists, slandering activists, it's, calling protesters rioters, as we are now seeing in the US. It's an old trick from an old box of tricks that have been used time and time again. So unless there is a real push at the grassroots level to reject that, to reiterate where people stand, and to push forward candidates and policies that reflect that change, then I fear that what we will be stuck with is the aftermath of the Trump tsunami, complete and utter devastation. That's really the fear here. I think maybe just an example of how the conversation can change. I read a letter by Jamal Bowman in the Riverdale Press. I'll send you a link, Zeina. It was in response to a letter written to him by Rabbi Weiss, who wrote to express concern about this Democratic hopeful or Democratic candidate in New York because he's pro-Palestinian. So, you know, he must be a terrible person. And I think that his dignified answer is an amazing example of how you can counter that intimidation. And how you can talk about everybody's humanity and how you can be consistent with your values of standing up for Black lives, of calling out racist policies, of seeing the humanity of Palestinians, and also speaking out about anti-Semitism. You can do all of these things at the same time. One doesn't have to cancel out the other. In fact, it cannot cancel out the other. If we do that, then yes, maybe, God help us, we can't thank Trump in the end. Absent of that, we will just be picking up the pieces.
Thank you, Nour. Huwaida, you want to take a stab at that one?
I mean, I essentially agree with Nour, and it's true in that, and it's one of the things that I worry about with a potential Biden presidency. Not that God forbid, that we should have Trump for another 4 years. But not only as it concerns Palestine, I worry about the progressive movement in general, and the willingness of like the mainstream media and some moderates or whatever you want to call them that are willing now to talk about the progressive issues because Trump is kind of the antithesis of that, and that it will be stifled in a sense if Biden comes into power, into the presidency with almost that he will kind of placate at a very basic level, but not push that we won't. Let me say, I don't even like to talk about this because I hope it doesn't happen, but what I don't want to happen is for the movement to let up on this push for real systemic change. And just because Biden's going to speak nicer, because he's going to try to placate us with certain words, because he won't be as dramatic and as grotesque and as just reprehensible as Trump, I don't want us to let up. So the vote is not enough. And on Palestine, I think it'll even be worse. I mean, here I hope we don't let up, that we continue to push for the radical changes that we want to see. And Biden is not radical. So in a sense, it's going to take more from us, because the opposition will not look as scary. But yeah, I think also when it comes to Palestine, the same kinds of things that Israel is going to continue to colonize. Congress is going to continue funding it. And the mainstream media will not speak about it anymore because there isn't Trump there that's buddy-buddy with Netanyahu. The mainstream media will be less critical. The moderates who are in Congress that are speaking up now will not as much, and that could be very detrimental. And so I think we just have to kind of be aware of it and just escalate our work, the alliances that we're making, and raising our voices in the streets. And I just wanted to, I hope all the panelists can see the chat, right? Because there's something in there from Nancy mentioning that a local, I think, BDS group that you have in Virginia, and asking people that want to get involved to connect. There, everyone can see that. She said there's a coalition in Virginia that's dedicated to the issues that we talked about, and that is connected with the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which I mentioned. It's called the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights, vchr.org, if people wanted to connect with them.
Thank you, Huwaida. I just want to quickly add to this. You guys don't, particularly as Palestinians or advocates or people who stand in solidarity with us, as far as I'm concerned, I refuse to endorse, I refuse to work on anything to do with the Biden campaign when it has to do with Palestine unless I see change. And that's been my stance, and I'm pretty vocal about this. it's constantly, there's a certain amount of attack on particularly Palestinians who say, because we refuse to say, we'll support Biden because he's, better than Trump, or Trump is bad. But I refuse. I mean, I refuse, and then being blamed if he wins, if Trump wins again. But I refuse because I truly believe in the power of my vote and my voice, and I take it very, very seriously. And when people run for office, they run to get votes based on policy. They don't run to get votes against somebody else. So it is incumbent, for me personally, I am working diligently to try to make change in policy in order for me to vote for, whether it's Biden or anybody, down ballot, as we say. So we have to keep pushing. We cannot let up, and we cannot give endorsements and give our votes away just because somebody's a little bit less bad than the other person. Sorry. And then the other question was earlier on, and let me see. It said along the lines, oh, there we go. Many Americans did not know of the oppression Black community dealt with every day until they watched the George Floyd video, along with many of similar ones. Does Israel block internet communications for Palestine like India has done with India-occupied Kashmir? Is it difficult for Palestinians to reach out to the world via social media? And I'm going to go with Nour first.
No, it hasn't blocked internet. It makes sure that the kind of services that we have are always one step behind what Israel has, but that's a different issue. But it does censor, and it does hold Palestinians accountable for expressing their opinions. So there are dozens of Palestinians who are detained and imprisoned every year because of what they post on Facebook. There is an agreement between the Israeli government and Facebook, surprise, surprise, about censoring Palestinian content on Facebook. There have been campaigns, waves of Palestinian journalists in particular and activists who suddenly found themselves locked out of their accounts or had their accounts deactivated or were forbidden to be on Facebook because of their activism. A lot of journalists are also denied the right to be live on Facebook for prolonged periods of time. So there are a lot of ways in which to restrict the Palestinian ability to engage. I do think, however, that social media has provided us with very important outlets that there's still censorship. I mean, but it's a bit, we can get around it a bit easier than mainstream corporate media, which basically doesn't see us unless we're killing someone, unless we're angry, but it doesn't really bother to ask why are these people angry? Why are they screaming? I remember from my years as a journalist in the field, having many upset conversations with my editors, some of my editors and colleagues, who were so used to the programmed way of doing corporate media. So when something happens, they ask the usual questions, and they don't ask me as a reporter the most important question, which is why, right? And so social media does provide an outlet, but it's not nearly enough. And there are, social and language barriers. I think once we break the barrier of not seeing the other, of not recognizing the other's humanity in principle, then it would be much easier to see Palestinian content. Because first we have to make the very conscious decision, very conscious proclamation internally that all these people, Palestinians, Tibetans, Yemenis, Syrians, Bengalis, all peoples are equal. All peoples are deserving of the same rights. Once we recognize that, they don't have to be suffering and starving and facing something that we consider to be an injustice for us to feel their pain or to see them as equal. We need to start at the principle. And then it becomes easier to see the connections, to see the bonds, and to see what organizations actually talk about Palestine and how we can get more informed. And I think I can say from my years of living in the US, I lived and I studied in San Francisco, I learned to never underestimate the power of an individual voice in the community about Palestine and about everything else. And so, don't be shy, not just to ask, but to also speak out and to discuss these things and to lay them bare out there, because it's time that we don't, have this conversation only in closed rooms out of fear of, being labeled. It's time to reject all those labels all at the same time. And for future reference, please feel free if you need information, if you have questions, reach out to me personally. I'm sure to Huwaida and Zeina as well. But feel free to contact me on my social media and ask whatever questions you want. I'm always happy to engage and answer questions so that you can be informed.
Thank you, Nour. And for those who don't know, Gilly posted our Twitter pages earlier in the chat. Roll up a little bit, you'll see it. I'm going to move on a little bit quicker. I'm going to go to Huwaida. Sorry, I'm going to jump to you, Huwaida, with this one. Who are the strongest Palestinian allies in Congress?
We have some good ones. You talked about Bernie Sanders in the Senate. Elizabeth Warren has come along in the Senate, not as great, but she has in her campaign, she was actually a little bit better than she was earlier. In the House, we have more. Obviously, we have a Palestinian. We, in 2018, elected the first Palestinian American female congressperson, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who's been very outspoken and wonderful. We also have a Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, though I know she's controversial on some other issues. She has been good on Palestine. She was one of the first ones to come out and support boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. AOC is good. Mark Pocan is good. I'm probably not going to be able to name them off the top of my head, but some of them also, it's something I mentioned and it's in the resolution that's in your state packet, is HR Resolution 2407, which is, I don't know if you talked about it, Zeina, but it's, Zeina included it in the resolution in calling for support for this resolution, which it's so simple. It just says that Israel is not allowed to use US aid money, the 3.8 billion that we give it per year, to militarily detain, abuse, interrogate, torture Palestinian children, because Palestinian children in the occupied Palestinian territories are subjected to Israeli military law. So they are not even put through a civilian justice system. It's a military injustice system where over 99% are convicted. And they go through really terror. They don't have basic rights. They are taken from their beds in the middle of the night. They are abused. They're not allowed to have their parents present. They're not allowed to have a lawyer present. And they spend months and years of their lives behind bars for very little or nothing. And so this resolution says Israel is not allowed to use US money for that. And it only has, that was sponsored by Betty McCollum. She's another big one. She's a great champion of Palestinian rights from Minnesota. She is the sponsor of this resolution, and it only has 23 co-sponsors, whereas the Senate bill that we talked about earlier, just, in the Senate has almost half the Senate, like 38 co-sponsors. Where a very basic one that talks about our money will not be used to abuse children it's like pulling teeth to get members of Congress to sign on. But if you look up House Resolution 2407, you'll see other members of the House that, can at least agree that Palestinian children shouldn't be abused with US dollars.
It's actually in the chat. I just dropped the link in the chat, and others have been dropping links also. And I'm of the mindset that I really dislike ending a meeting like that and just saying bye. So I'm going to end the questions there. Yes, and Don Baer also is a co-signer from Virginia. So I want to end the conversation there. I want to plug bchr.org and you know, thank you all for your support to me personally and to this panel and for Palestine. Your solidarity and your questions are so important, and they mean a lot to us. And I love you, Huwaida and Nour. Thank you for doing this. And Nour, thank you for staying up so late. And Huwaida, thank you for taking time away from the kids. And thank you to every single person that attended this. And I hope to keep the conversation going. And please ask us questions. We're more than happy to answer. And free Palestine. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for having us.